For those of you who don't know me, I'm Shelly Simmons. I work with the Colorado State Forest Service here out of La Junta, and I essentially work in all of southeastern Colorado. I work in 8 counties, and I'm kind of known as the tree dork. We're State Forest Service, we're an arm of CSU, but we specifically work with trees. And so that's how, over the years, I've gotten to know these 3 gentlemen. I work on several watershed projects where we do tamarisk and Russian olive control, and through those avenues I've gotten involved a little bit more in more than tamarisk and Russian olive, just the whole concept of invasive species and how they really impact our natural resources and our economies. And unfortunately, invasive species aren't glamorous, you know, they're not like fire or floods. But I contend that they're really just as, you know, an important issue that needs to have equal attention. And so that's why I'm always wrangling these 3 gentlemen to come down this way, and I always appreciate it when they help out. So we're gonna just go ahead and start off. Well, one more thing I guess I'm supposed to announce. There's a poster over here in the corner that talks about 3 new aquatic invasive species at Pueblo Reservoir. And there's a paper on this, a report, so I'm not going to read them off because they're too hard to pronounce. But please take a look at that poster over there. So we'll start off with Dr. George Beck, and he has been at Colorado State University, and I changed my page, for 28 years? Yep. 28 years, and he is a professor of weed science at CSU. And kind of a highlight of what George has been doing is he has spent about 27 years pursuing improved public policy on invasive species at the federal level. So he'll talk a little bit about that.
Thank you, Shelly. Well, good afternoon. Is there a button I'm not supposed to push? Because I invariably do that.
No, just the side ones, and this is the pointer.
Okay. How many have invasive and noxious weeds? Go ahead, raise your hand. Don't be shy. How many do not? Oh, rats, because I could have given you some. I actually put some on the bumper of my car on the way down here. It keeps us in business. All kidding aside, invasive species is a really interesting issue. Now, we've called them noxious weeds for years, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive nor inclusive. There's a little bit of separation. My colleague, Dr. Ryder, will explain a little bit more about what makes something noxious, but these are the bad actors. You know, they're not the tumbleweeds. Well, be it down here, tumbleweeds could be considered a real serious problem. There's huge piles of them. But normally, on a statewide basis, we don't think things like Russian thistle or kochia are, you know, is equal to a Canada thistle or a leafy spurge or a tamarisk, for that matter. You cross the river, it's almost disheartening to see. So I was pestering Dan to see when he's going to have all of his little diarrhea trained so to kill all of the tamarisk along the rivers. He said he's working on that right now. He's got a little tiny whip that he's using to get them into shape. But anyway, my job today is to tell you how we got to where we are. You know, other than, you know, we've been disturbing the ground as humans for a long, long time. Now, we have a number of actors throughout the state that are major problems for us, and I got a few of them here. You may have some of these, but we got Canada thistle, downy brome, or cheatgrass. Of course, everyone has that. You literally can close your eyes and point, and you're looking at some. Where's the next one? Oh, purple loosestrife. Don't think there's any of that down here, and you're lucky you don't have it. I think the tamarisk will keep it out, if nothing else. Of course, yellow toadflax is my personal favorite. I think we finally figured after 28 years how to kill this weed. It's about time. Diffuse snapweed, it's gonna be out here. I think it's a little too dry down here even for diffuse snapweed, but there'll be a few spots. And of course, Dalmatian toadflax, and this is the only plant that has invaded the shortgrass steppe. Nothing else, not even cheatgrass, has invaded the shortgrass steppe. Now a little bit about, and then one of my personal favorites around Fort Collins is leafy spurge. And this one has truly gained about almost 100% or so in the 28 years that we have lived here. It's absolutely amazing. It's a very, very aggressive plant. From the lowest elevations in our state to the highest, you just don't have it yet because no one's brought it to you. And it'll grow well here. And probably mostly near the river. I wouldn't expect it to escape too far, but any wet spot, and it'll be there. And the wet spot could be 20 feet deep, and they'll find it. All right, some around here you're aware of. Of course, everyone has Russian knapweed in eastern Colorado. It's just very, very, very plentiful down here. I'll let it go at that. And of course, tamarisk, most of us are familiar with this water hog. I mean, some of the data on this, someone actually calculated out that all of the tamarisk in the desert Southwest uses twice as much water than all the cities in Southern California. They actually penciled that out. I thought someone had made it up, but they didn't. Russian olive is an increasing problem. If you've ever tried to get rid of this tree, it is very hard to kill. I think a nuclear weapon would work, but that's a little drastic. And last but not least, this is Trinidad's favorite plant, African rue, and I would be on the watch for this one because it's going to move this way. It might already be here, and it's very hard to detect until it's too late, and it's very, very hard to kill. But anyway, so those are some of the actors we have. I have found it to be of value to explain a little bit about the history of where we are and how we got here today, because some people actually believe that the invasive weeds and noxious weed management is an option, and of course it is not. It's like ignoring water management. It's going to come back to haunt you big time. That's why they're on this list. This is a concept that's thousands of years old. Ever since we started farming the ground, clear back in the Greeks, and so we've had these problem plants. So I'll try to bring some of this to attention. So a little bit we'll start off in general about the U.S. and the Intermountain Noxious Weed Advisory Committee was formed by a gentleman named George Hittle years ago, and he dragged me by the collar, kicking and screaming and helping on this, and I've been fiddling with this ever since. But we started in 1987, and all we really wanted was for the BLM and Forest Service to do a better job of managing weeds. And it has mushroomed to something much, much larger. I don't know if that's bad or good, but sometimes politics plays out in some very interesting ways. How many of you are familiar with the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force? You know, with the issues we have in Colorado with some of our aquatic areas, well, this would be the group that would be most important and involved in that. But they formed in 1990, so these are things that are not too distant past. And I thought the ANSTF was around for a long, long time. Then my personal favorite is FICMANU. Say that real fast 3 times. But this is the Federal Interagency Committee for the Management of Noxious and Exotic Weeds. So this one even predates the term invasive. So yeah, I love that. So it's been around a very, very long time. Now, if we look at what's been happening in Colorado, a lot of the stuff that's been happening at the national level has been mirrored here, and it's because the same group of people have been working on it. So we try to get things done here in our own state and try to do the same thing at the national level. We've had much more success in Colorado than at the nation as a whole. But in 1990, we had our first statewide noxious weed law. Before that, I referred to this as an unpopular popular process, where people had to petition the county commissioners to, create a weed district, and it could never be the entire county because of district laws and some of the old laws in the state. But at any rate, I always figured this was something, the reason we didn't have too much other than a patchwork quilt of districts, because I'm one of these people now, that if you said you will put the state will come in here and put a money tree in my yard, but it's going to cost me another $1 in taxes, I would vote it down. And we have historically done that. So we ended up with a problem of an unfunded mandate with this, because we had funded this, and I got laughed out of the Capitol when they said, we want $10 million a year for this. They said, well, it's worth $100 million a year. No one wanted to believe that either. So we continue to have this unfunded mandate to this day, even though we tried to slip that in under the door. The law was amended in 1996. We expanded the weed list because we had a whole whopping 4 noxious weeds, and at the time when we did this in 1990, I thought, well, this is ludicrous. We have so many noxious weeds, why would we stop with 3 knapweeds and leafy spurs? But we needed to have a learning curve. We needed to figure out how to do this. Could we do this? Could our county and state government be trusted? A lot of private landowners were very, very concerned about that, and some of them remain that way to this day. We created a statewide weed coordinator position at that time. Steve is, you're the second weed coordinator. You're the third? Who was the second? Eric was the first.
Kelly.
Oh, that's right, Kelly Ewing, I forgot. But anyway, it's created the statewide weed coordinator, and then also the Noxious Weed Trust Fund, which is still alive. It's limping. I wouldn't say well, but there's some good news about that as well. I'll let Steve expand upon that later. And in 2001, we wrote a plan, and I wrote this, let's say we very loosely. Eric Lane, the then state weed coordinator, wrote the plan because he couldn't get us to do it, the Weed Advisory Committee. And at any rate, we adopted that, and we continue to work with that to this day. The strategies in our state flow right from that plan. It's pretty cool. It was endorsed by over 40 very diverse groups around the state. Strange bedfellows, quite frankly. And if you look at the front page, that you can see for yourself that this is interesting that we could come to grips and on an issue where historically groups like the Sierra Club and Club 20 definitely don't see eye to eye, but we could agree on this one. We also created the ABC list in 2003, which has been of tremendous value for people because now we can target those plants that we really want to eradicate, and the ones that are really big problems are the B list, that's the rub in the middle, but we're expanding on that. Our program is building and going much, much better than it has in the past. We have a long way to go, of course, because the weeds outstrip us all the time. Now, currently, we probably, and it's anyone's best guess because mapping is a very difficult chore, and I have several colleagues around the state. They're at the county weed supervisor level, and some of them, they have some of the best programs, and I have the greatest respect in the world for them. But they tell me, it's George, if I'm out there mapping weeds, I'm not killing them. Well, I want you to kill them, but we got to know what's there too. We have to know what's out there, or do we have 2.6 million or 1.3 million? Now, when you're trying to get money out of the legislature, those statistics become very, very important. And so very recently, a study was completed by the Ag Econ department at CSU that better defines the problem. How many weeds were in that? Well, there were just 10 weeds, weren't there? Yeah. Yeah, and Canada thistle was amongst them. At any rate, it comes out to about $14+ million a year that this costing our state. So it's not a cheap thing, but it's not 14 billion either, which is good news. The situation is clearly improving, especially at the state level. You know, the county levels have all been pretty good. We get along better than we used to. There's always been the issue. You pick a state, any state, there's always an issue between state and local government. You know, it's just the nature of the beast in our country. We still have some serious issues with federal agencies, and it's just because it's all over the board. There's very little consistency. I know places that the Forest Service does a grand job, is phenomenal, and yet the next forest over, they're doing nothing. It's not a priority for us. You know, that's not your decision to make. One of the laws we passed back in 1990 at the federal level says that agencies, federal agencies that manage land, must cooperate with state and local government to do so. And so they're required to work with us in our state. Well, you can well imagine that's falling on deaf ears, but we keep pursuing that. And I'll address that a little bit more. Private landowners are all over the board. You know, it depends on how much land they have. I mean, someone that has 10,000 acres is probably doing this readily, but you can't afford it on all 10,000 acres. And if you have 1 acre like me, sometimes it just gets overlooked. I raise very good weeds in my yard, but they're all for experimental purposes, of course. All right, so what do we need? Well, of course, everyone needs more money. I've been writing checks, and you can play handball with them, unfortunately, but we need to end this unfunded mandate, and we're getting close. We're getting closer all the time. We need to increase the Noxious Weed Trust Fund, because with that trust fund, then the Department of Agriculture is able to help out funding projects around the state. And I don't know how many projects have been funded over the last, 15 years? I mean, it's phenomenal. And what this does is this gets people working together, breaks down the barriers and the borders associated with that. Because there's always, I remember, how many of you remember the Tweed Ring back in New York? It was like 1880, 1890. And there was a caricature in the New York Times of these guys standing in a circle, and they were all pointing to the next person like that. Well, weeds tend to be that way. You know, it's my neighbor's fault. If my neighbor would control these weeds, I'd have none. Of course, this is true to a no small degree. My neighbor gave us all the dandelions in our yard. I was looking at them this morning going, I know one thing I got to do this weekend before I go to Washington. At any rate, we had this year, I don't know what the status of this is. Steve may be able to help you out on what's going on, but there's $700,000 additional dollars that the legislature has put up to be part of the trust fund. We'll see if it actually comes through or not, but that would be a huge advantage then for us as a state. Now, let's look at the national level for a little bit. And I'm not going to go clear back in time, but back in 1996, of December. Now, so by this time, I've been going to D.C. about 10 years. So I was cynical within 10 months, but I'm really cynical now. So by 1996, I just figured, well, you know, another opportunity. We'll see what happens. I went with these characters to Washington, D.C. We visited with then President Clinton's science advisors, and they patted us on the head and said, yes, we are doing a very good job. And I stood up and I read them the Riot Act. And I figured, what the hell, you know, I might as well, because we're not going to get anything out of this anyway. And I just figured, yep, it's just another one of those disappointing trips to Washington, D.C. But the next day, I got a letter or a phone call from Dan Simberloff. I think Dan's still the chair of the Nancy Hunger Gore Institute at the University of Tennessee, but that's Al Gore's sister that passed away years ago, and so he and Al Gore were personal friends. Think what you want of Al Gore. He punted this thing up for others to grab a hold of. But we wrote this letter to him. And because Simberloff knew him personally, he then took this up to President Clinton, and out of it came the executive order that created the National Invasive Species Council. So I thought, wow, we finally have made it. We're going to make some progress. So in 1999, this happened, and it was clear up to the cabinet secretary level. We're going, wow, something good has to come of this. So you can see where I'm going? Yeah, I was beating my head against a brick wall. It's made up of actually, it's all the cabinet members now, and the director of USAID, EPA. I don't know, their mothers are probably on it too, as far as I know. But Agriculture, Interior, and Commerce are the co-chairs of this. And do you suppose, you know, these characters? So here's our list. Do you think these guys sit around in a cabinet meeting talking about invasive species? Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I don't think so. They don't even know what it is. You know, boy, now I've lost my train of thought. Anyway, I'll continue on here. We're pushing this pretty hard, and this is the object, one of the objects of our current legislation I'll mention in just a couple of minutes. So the National Invasive Species Council is what I just showed you. Their staff in the Invasive Species Advisory Committee, which was formed also as part of this executive order, came up with this grand blueprint, this plan, the National Invasive Species Management Plan. And I know everyone in this room has read that, correct? Go ahead, humor me, just say, yeah, sure. No one even knows it exists. You can find it. It's very hard to find too, believe it or not, even though your tax dollars paid for that. Anyway, there's all kinds of stuff in there. You can well imagine we made a mountain out of a molehill there. We re-updated it in 2008, included some new things, and now it's sitting on the shelf again, gathering more dust, unfortunately. So where are we today? Again, there's industries that feel threatened by this. A lot of private landowners feel threatened by this. Now, we've gotten better because we realized that no one's going to come out and tell me that I must do this or I'm going to take over your land. I'm going to take your land from you. No one's done that, at least here in Colorado for sure. But the nursery and landscape trades, very threatened by this. The seed trade and the pet industry. I remember a friend of mine told me once, you know who can stop all this? Just like that, is the pet industry. If they want to make this go away, they can make it go away tomorrow. And the guy that Rex is their jurist advocate has been a jurist advocate for them since 1971. He's got a lot of contacts in Washington, but so far he hasn't pushed that too hard. Aquatic farming, the fishing industry, and almost anything that do with land use, there's a little bit of threatening here, but actually it's the private landowners that feel most threatened, private property owners, because what constitutes an invasive species? I was on the Invasive Species Advisory Committee for 6 years, and when we wrote this definition exercise I'm going to mention next, I remember I had a guy from, I want to say he was from South Carolina. He was a pretty nice guy. But this was the woodpecker, the ivory-billed woodpecker, that was one that's just, it's an endangered species. He was saying, this is at a public meeting, and at every word, everything you utter, from coughing to groaning, whatever you do, it gets recorded. And this guy said, yeah, we have some of our landowners that are cutting down all the trees in their property so they don't get the woodpecker on it. Oh, man. So this is what we were faced with. And how do we come up with a compromise that we can agree on? Well, here's the list of organisms. Someone wanted a white list. And they go, you know, I think there's 300,000 species of plants alone that have been identified around the world, and we're counting. So you could literally have a list that's 1 million species long. I don't think anyone will pay attention to that. but it's very, very controversial for some. So we spent about 2.5, almost 3 years trying to explain what we meant, more importantly, what we didn't mean by what's an invasive species. Yes, it was a very esoteric exercise, but you've never seen 35 people so excited in your life. Because like everyone was fighting for their own little square inch of property someplace. What we found for those who were the most concerned over this was they have no problem with reasonable and legitimate public policy that's based on sound science, but they have trouble with things that appear to be capricious and arbitrary. Imagine that. So we tried to clear the air there, tried to put some common sense to this, and that's very, very difficult working with any government body because we try to get one size fits all, especially at the federal level, and it oftentimes doesn't work well. This is just another case in point. So we have a disconnect then between Washington, D.C. and the rest of the country about this, and of course, every aspect of our lives. It's nothing unusual, but there's this huge problem. And the issue with Congress is that they've been kicking this can down the road because no one owns it. Neither party says this is ours, because no one's going to get reelected on this. Yep, it's not a very sexy issue, but it certainly will take all the money from your pocket. I wanted to someday build a little caricature that will walk up here, be a hologram, and take my wallet out of my pocket and make it look like Canada Thistle or something. It would drive the point home. But we have some states that are doing really, really well. In the West, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming historically have been stalwarts in this. Hawaii and Florida has so much, they just look at us and they say, you guys are nuts. They've seized the bull by their own horns and they're taking care of it. Their state legislature coughs up $10 million a year just for Melaleuca alone. And they have everything you can think of because they're in the perfect spot for it. And how long is it going to be before one of the pythons eats someone's child? And then we will be spawned as a society. And unfortunately, we usually have to wait for something like that to occur. So the leadership at the federal level, I'll just be honest with you, it's pathetic. I'm being polite here. It's absolutely pathetic. And this is what we're trying to cure. I see the Hal Pierce out here in Colorado, and Hal works for the Forest Service. He's the invasive species coordinator for the White River National Forest. He's one of my heroes. I mean, he can stretch $3,000 further than anyone else I know. I actually think he has a bank account that he's never opened up in Raton, and he just goes and visits that every once in a while. I don't know for sure. I understand you can still do that. But at the president and cabinet level, the leadership is just not there. It's like they never talk about it. It's constantly something that's subverted to someone else. During the Bush administration, we knew clearly where the buck stopped. It stopped with Mark Ray, and he was one of the assistant secretaries of agriculture for marketing and inspection, I believe. But he made it very clear that nothing more was going to be done. So we've been lied to for years, but now it's a conflicting priority, and it's been so for a long time, but we got the issues of climate change, energy independence, and no one really knows what to do. So it's languishing. It's kind of in no man's land at the moment. Budgets have been slashed for years now. I mean, some of these agencies, their budgets have been cut by over 50%. That makes it very difficult to do anything, much less something that really has never been targeted except by a few people out, in the hinterlands. Congress is clearly confused. Now, as of yesterday, a few days ago, it was only 89, but we had our bill introduced back in February. So 90 bills over the past 14 years have been introduced. One is passed, and it was never funded. And Joel Heffley wrote the bill, so it was never funded. We were always the whole idea there was just to jumpstart, invasive species management districts. So we've had no funding from Congress to date. So our current approach is we're trying to shore up the state efforts. We've been working with the governors, trying to get the governors excited. The governors always tell us, well, we're broke. And I said, fine, then you need to go and help us lobby Congress to get some money flowing to states. So that was one of our original ideas, is to get the governors to help us. And in 2008, we formed this thing called the Champion States Initiative. Governor Ritter was involved, and Governor Schweitzer up in Montana. Those were the two big ones. And then now Governor Otter in Idaho is our main champion. But this has kind of been pushed aside, because with the current fiscal climate, we're not going to get this $200 million moved to the states that we wanted to. We had some asks for the feds. We want you to do a better job. We want you to increase management by 5-fold. We still want that. That's still the order of the day. But then we were going to redirect some money. wow, man, the governors were hot on this one. They thought this was grand stuff. And we had a nice formula, but then we have the political divide about, well, who can really do things best? You know, is it the states that can do things best, or is it at the federal level? And, well, you need both of them. We need both of them without question. So at any rate, there was this GAO report in, I can't remember, it was 2012. Oh, actually, there were several of these. But at that time, we did this. We had about 5%, 7% of the amount of money that was being spent on invasive species actually going on the ground to help solve a problem. You know, the rest of it, no one was going to the Bahamas and having a party, but no one could track with money. That problem exists to this day. All right, so let me give you a quick rundown of why this is important. We need to start moving. I actually did this for the city of Ridgeway. They have a problem with spotted knapweed, and they're trying to figure out what to do. Well, pretty soon it's going to cost them a lot of money. It's pretty straightforward. You can, if you had a small patch of weeds, one or two, say the size of this table, pull them. It's pretty easy. You can hand pull them. But what time they get to the size of this room, you got a whole different issue. Now you're talking a lot of labor. But so you have herbicides, you can hand pull, you can dig, you can rely on natural seed rain for reclamation, or you can do the seeding. I chose Milestone for this one as an example. It's about 18 bucks an acre. We figured labor at 12, and seed costs around 200, which is real cheap. In fact, it's much, much more expensive than that. So if we start off at 10 square feet, you're looking at 20 cents worth of herbicides, and if you put some seed on it, you know, you're looking at $3 for just to cure that problem. And that's assuming everything works perfectly, of course. Now, look how this increases dramatically as we come down here to starting at 100 acres. Now, 100-acre infestation is not that big, but look at the difference in price. Now you're talking $22,000. This is why we need to get going now and quit fiddling. So this is why we're on the Fed's back. So you can see graphically, Nolan, this is for you, how much of an increase we have. The inflection point there from 10 to 100 acres is 10 times as much. Imagine that. So this is the problem we're having, and this is where we think some of the money is being wasted. This is a progression. And this is the last slide I'll leave you with until I tell you how much we're going to, and this is what got in Congress's attention. We figure a 12 to 14% expansion rate per year. So if we start out in 2009, this is the data, these are the data that the feds gave us. They treat 1.6 million acres a year, which is pretty good. But considering we have about 40 or 50 million acres, you know, with that, we're not even getting close. So in 2009, about 48 million. Well, this year it should be somewhere around 76 million. We're losing ground. So that's even taking into account what's been controlled. So I took off that 1.6 million acres. Those were completely controlled, which is not ever the case. Anyone that's ever battled weeds, especially something like Russian knapweed or tamarisk, it's not a one-shot deal. So this is assuming that that was 100% successful. And so what it is, we're getting like 1% of what we need to do. That's ridiculous, and it's costing a lot of money. We spent $2.2 billion a year on this as a nation. So our next move is stop the rhetoric. We need to quit kicking the damn can down the road, excuse me. But this is important enough, and if these were just the weeds alone are incredible, but now we have these problems, there are aquatic problems in our reservoirs. We have the mussels in the reservoirs here. We got serious problems. They can't be killed. We don't. You can drain the dam. That's all you can do. Can you imagine draining Lake Mead? They're pretty excited in Southern California that they're going to lose all the water they have. And it won't be because of drought. It's going to be because the California aqueduct is shut with quagga mussels. They have no idea how to deal with this. And they say, well, if we go in there and try to clean up that aqueduct, because some places it's closed, they have to shut off the water. Now, do you think the people in Southern California would be a little upset if they turn on their tap in the morning and there was no water? Yeah, there's 10 million very angry people. So we're asking people to help us advocate for invasive species management. And we have a plan. We have a bill in the House right now. The primary sponsors are Rob Bishop out of Utah and Stephen Horsford out of Nevada. It targets, I should say, focuses on the Forest Service and the land management agencies and the Department of Interior just to get the job going. And it clearly directs the Secretaries of Agriculture and Interior to create an adequately funded program. They don't really want a line item because that's very difficult to work with, but they expect to see this is what we want for invasive species when they submit their budget to Congress to be approved or work with. So this is where we stand right now. We're hoping that we can get this thing passed this year. We're going to Washington next week to brief with the Western Caucus at the interaction of sage grouse and invasive species, so that'll be an interesting opportunity. So I guess I will hold off on questions until our panel. Thank you very much.
Okay, so next up we have Dr. Steve Ryder. He is the State Weed Coordinator under the Colorado Department of Agriculture for the state of Colorado. And Steve's main mission is to facilitate cooperation between federal, state, local, and private landowners on noxious weed management. And I really have to give a big hand to Steve because he makes it down here all the time. He's working with a lot of our counties and a lot of our partnerships. So he's getting things rolling.
Thanks, Shelly.
Sure, sure.
Thanks for everyone who's still remaining after this is the last panel of the forum and the last day, and it's after lunch, and it's what else is going on? It's a nice day outside, and you're all in here wanting to talk about weeds, so I really appreciate that. I do have, by way of introduction, I talk with people all the time. I talk with a lot of college kids and high school kids too, every now and then about career days and that sort of thing, and they all ask me, so what is the career path to become a state weed coordinator? Actually, none of them ask me that. They really have no idea how I meet with the western states, people in my position in other states, and we all come from very widely scattered areas of emphasis. Mostly, from the scientific perspective, from the policy perspective, there's a lot of different ways of approaching this, and the states are all very different. If you can, I don't know if you can see, you probably cannot read what my little calf is saying over here because I thought it was going to be a huge screen. But the little calf over there is saying, please don't make me eat the musk thistle. And you can see over here that musk thistles are kind of one of my favorite weeds. If you have kids or grandkids who are into zombies, which I don't know anything about, but the musk thistles, they're these rangy kind of tall things with and their arms kind of move in the wind. And then when you turn your back, they seem to move. So they're just a really creepy plant, and this is out by Agate and Simla area, so it's not around your area. But what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit, start off with a little bit of discussion about barn raising, a view of overview. I can't read all the way over there. Overview of the Noxious Weed Act. A little bit about what the Department of Agriculture's response is to noxious weeds. And a few more comments about resources that are available, because as you mentioned, George mentioned, this is primarily a county-centered endeavor that we're involved in when it comes to noxious weeds. With the state government provides resources and a few other things. And there's some reasons for that, which we'll discuss here in a second. In terms of barn raising, barn raising is often used as an example of a cooperative arrangement that benefits, a single individual or family, which, when carried out over a number of times, will actually helps a community thrive and succeed. And this is one of the things that, whether it's a small barn or a big barn in different parts of the country, it's codified to an extent in the Noxious Weed Act. That if you look in the act itself, it does say the last two lines there, things that may materially damage your neighbors. So it has this connotation that if that single individual is acting on their own, is probably not going to get the job done when it comes to controlling noxious weeds. So this is not anything, you've seen pictures of this probably more down here. In fact, I've seen a number of pictures from down here having to do with these tumbleweeds. This is actually in Wyoming. But there's about 400 or so species of plants in the state that we might consider weeds on any given day. These are, it's something as innocuous or something that we've become so not enamored of, but familiar with, such as dandelions. These are plants that are, they show up all the time. They're kind of a pain, they're in your garden all the time, but they're not necessarily noxious weeds. And the distinction here has to do with alien, and by alien, this is not the zombie metaphor, continue. Alien in this case does mean plants that are non-native to Colorado. These are plants or plant parts that have one or more of the following characteristics. They're aggressive invaders. They might be poisonous to livestock, or they could be carriers of detrimental insects, pests, or diseases. So, and there's a catch-all at the in the act as well, and you can read that as well. It's just kind of an umbrella of characteristics. Here's an example just north of here. These are two List B noxious weeds that are kind of right on the side of the road on County Road 71 coming down from Ordway. But this is Russian knapweed, which is all in the front, in the foreground to the midground here, and tamarisk in the background of it. And this is along one of the canals that is fairly close to Lake Meredith. And you can see this is where Russian knapweed is just starting to bloom. This is probably sometime in early June. But the tamarisk, and I'll leave a lot of the tamarisk discussion to Dr. Bean coming up. But these are very aggressive invaders. Russian knapweed is toxic, if not poisonous, to horses. So there's a kind of a double whammy there. And these make it very difficult. There's certainly no productive use of at least this little corner of the land. And of course, the further you get away from this area, the Russian knapweed thins out a bit, and the shortgrass comes back a little bit better. Why manage weeds? We all know this. These are things that it's a bit more of an education to an urban audience than it is to folks who actually are involved in agriculture. Agricultural productivity, of course, is one of the paramount concerns of the Department of Agriculture. At the same time, we want to protect livestock and humans from poisonous plants, and there are a few of noxious weeds that we have that are poisonous to humans. In fact, right now we get calls every now and then from parents who have kids who've been playing in myrtle spurge. And some of you probably know what myrtle spurge is. It was a very popular landscaping plant back about 20 years ago or so, 15 or 20 years ago, and everybody planted it in their yards because it worked very well in sandy, arid environments, and nobody told it that it should stay inside the garden area when they planted it. And it took off, and it's something that we're trying to deal with continually up to today. We also want to protect native plant communities, and this is largely because of wildlife, for wildlife benefits. Wildlife is something that has evolved with these native plant communities. So when noxious weeds take them over, that wildlife habitat is often compromised. And there are parts, for example, places in Montana, a few millions of acres, where spotted knapweed has taken over an awful lot of what used to be very good elk habitat, and the elk are gone. They've gone somewhere else. And in a state where, in Colorado, where we have our Parks and Wildlife Department gets most of its funding from selling hunting and fishing licenses, this is a real, it's not only an environmental issue, it's also a financial issue for the state. Reduce the risk of wildfire. George spoke briefly about that, about the impact of cheatgrass as a fire threat to not only agricultural communities, but also right up into to larger communities where there is cheatgrass that is that runs right up to into towns in some parts more of the West Slope than other places. And then stopping the spread to and from neighbors. This is where it's awfully costly sometimes to manage these noxious weeds. And if your neighbor's not doing anything and you're doing the best you can, and then when you're done, all the weed seeds from your neighbor's yards blows over into yours, defeats all of that time and effort and expense that you've put into it. So again, it's a community effort. For those of you who want to know where the Noxious Weed Act lives statutorily, this is where you can find it. I don't think many of you are going to run right out to your library or back home to look on the website, but it is in the agriculture title of the statutes. And there's also a rule that administers the act, and that rule has many of the management plans for List B species, and I'll briefly tell you what that is here in a second. And it also spells out a fair amount of how enforcement is going to occur, if that's going to occur, and how we are going to manage the broader scale weeds, noxious weeds in general. So here's where in our website you can go to that About Us area, and then go right back over to where the rules and regs are. Okay, so the local governing entities are the ones who are out front, like I said before, the Noxious Weed Act, and that's largely because when the act was being debated, the counties did not want a strong, state program that was going to come and tell them what to do with their weeds. What that meant, though, is that the counties, and it's local entities, so it's municipalities as well, but they needed to step up and to work on focusing on not only their own problem weeds, but also these noxious weeds, which aren't oftentimes that common. Sometimes it's, there's a lot of parts of the southeastern part of the state does not have a lot of List A species. You've got plenty of List Bs, but they don't have the List A species, which are the ones that have not become well established in the state yet. And we can, it's cost effective to treat them now. This is what George mentioned too a little bit earlier. The state's role is for the most part to provide direction in the form of prioritization, the List A, B, and C amendment to the act, which was in 2003. List A species are our top priority because they're very small populations. We can try and eradicate them before they get a foothold and they become extraordinarily expensive to manage. The List B species are those which are established in the state, and I'll show you a few examples here pretty soon. They're very difficult. We may not eradicate them in at least our lifetime, but we can try to contain and control and eradicate the satellite species, the little populations that are kind of coming off of the main infestations. Resources is the bottom one. That's where, again, George mentioned the unfunded mandate, which was a complaint at the beginning for the counties primarily, that you're giving us this new job to do, but you're not going to give us any money. And that is one reason why we have 2 grant programs that we work with local communities, both counties, municipalities, and also conservation districts, some of the conservation districts that do noxious weeds, and some nonprofits even that do the same, to try and funnel resources to local entities to work on these key priority species. So with the act itself, primarily what we're trying to achieve with it is, if we provide information about the act, the seriousness of noxious weeds, how they affect wildlife habitat, agricultural productivity, We educate them on how to identify these weeds and how to treat them. And we give them some kind of resources, either directly or indirectly. This is how we can probably achieve at least 75, 85% compliance with the Act. And compliance is relatively, depending upon the species, easy to achieve. You know, all counties in the state are supposed to have at a minimum a weed board, a weed advisory board, and some form of a noxious weed plan. That's it. For List A species and for List B species that are subject to eradication in that county, then there needs to be some form of administration of that noxious weed plan, and those species need to be eradicated. The List A species particularly. If the county's not willing to do it, then we will probably step in and do it for them, and then we may send them a bill. That's never happened. The counties usually know that this is something that it's in their best interest to eradicate on their own without having us be heavy-handed about it, because we prefer not to be. And we do have we have good noxious weed programs at the county level in probably about 40 of the counties. We have in the other 24 counties, we either have people, there's a presence of individuals or groups such as conservation districts or nonprofits. There are a few counties where there is really not a whole lot going on, and we don't know the extent of the noxious weed program or problem. We have some knowledge, but we have our work cut out for us. I mean, this is a work in progress. Then I'll mention the Act provides local entities enforcement methods as well. So the Act does provide an awful lot of tools which can be used, and some counties are gung-ho about going out and they will enforce the Act on landowners pretty actively. In fact, I'm pretty impressed with some of the counties. A number of other counties will not do that. They will not be as heavy-handed. They are going to be kept. They're going to try and keep in mind their local communities, the political nature of private property rights and those sorts of things, that some communities are going to be more receptive to that collective action than others will. So you always need to show some pretty pictures. I won't show too many because George already did. But if you look over here, I just want to give you a few ideas of a List A species, which, wow, that's interesting. Okay, I'm trying to see around the around the columns here. On the left this is purple loosestrife, and George showed a slide of that as well. Cecily, the woman who is smiling, I can't believe it. It's probably about 100 degrees out, and you're standing in a foot of water, and there's not a bit of air moving at all. But this is purple loosestrife. It is largely from the Denver area, and it goes all the way out the South Platte Basin, well into Nebraska now. And fortunately, I guess there's also a plant called Phragmites that's more prevalent in Nebraska that is actually choking out the purple loosestrife. So I guess if you have enough dueling invasive species, you'll get some of your work done for you, I guess. On the right is this is Canada thistle. This is a particularly popular, well, it's a very well-known List B species. It's widespread and established in the state. It can be controlled. It's not as easy as some of the other thistles, but it is something that can be contained and controlled, even though it's going to be a long-term effort to do that. Let's see here. This is interesting. This was supposed to be a couple of slides ago, so we'll ignore it. Let's move on to Dalmatian toadflax. George mentioned this. This is in the High Park Fire area northwest of Fort Collins. This is an area that burned twice in 2012. And the Dalmatian toadflax has just took off following that fire. And this is an area that Dan and the insectary have been working with a number of state and federal agencies, because it's a mixed land ownership panel in there, are attempting to first of all find the boundaries of this. This may go into Wyoming. This may go for miles. But what we're trying to do is work with a biological control agent, a little insect which gets inside the plant and eats within the stem, which will either kill the plant or it'll make it very difficult for it to flower, thus reproduce. But Dalmatian, as you can tell, it's a pretty plant. So again, this is an escaped ornamental. This is an ornamental that we used to plant everywhere in our gardens, and it just decided that it liked the wild areas too, and took off. This is going to be one of your common areas where you're going to see Canada thistle. This is a borrow pit from a county road that you can see kind of right up in the front. There's also a smaller population back in here and kind of a little wet sub-irrigated area back where that tree is. A couple of mustards. This perennial pepperweed, or it's also called tall white top. It's probably something that you've seen around. It's under a lot of bridges, a lot of small bridges and culverts and stuff where it's kind of those weedy areas that really kind of no man's lands. These are very, very healthy pepperweed plants in the San Luis Valley. And then I always like to make fun of the lower right photo. This is hoary cress or white top. It's just coming out now. It's just starting to flower across the state now. And isn't that pretty? That's a very pretty, you can tell it's never been touched. And it's at a state park that I won't mention. With a really big lake northeast of Denver. But this is the multi-agency issue that we have with a lot of noxious weeds is that there's no land that's exempt from this problem. And the resources that are available vary by community, and state parks are no exception to that issue. Diffuse snapweed, George mentioned. Oh, that's Shelly's bag. That's
Want us to fix that for you?
Anyway, yeah, am I done? Okay, well, diffuse snapweed, we won't embarrass Shelly anymore, but this is something that, and George mentioned that it was, this is primarily, it's along the eastern plains, primarily to the north, but it's found throughout the state as well. One of the problems with diffuse snapweed is it doesn't like to stay where it is, and it will, as when the fall comes, it will tend to break off and tumble. And it'll spread its seeds like that. That's like what all tumbleweeds do. They'll tumble and they'll just drop seeds as they go. And diffuse is something that is growing around the Front Range, just like Dalmatian toadflax. I mean, we have some species that are really growing significantly. Leafy spurge, this is in Hewlett Gulch. This is 2 years after the fire. You can see, interesting here is that in the areas that on the upper left, these are areas that really, that soil is really scorched. And the leafy spurge just comes right on in. Whereas here, this is really pretty scorched. Almost got you in the eye there, sorry, Shelly. Here, but back up in here, where the fire just flashed over some of the grasses just popped right back, just fine. But where the soil really got scorched, it just seems that leafy spurge comes in very aggressively. So let me talk a little bit about the weed program, the noxious weed program itself. We have a few components to it. One of them is called EDRR, or Early Detection Rapid Response. And this is what we do with this is primarily the List A species. These are the ones that either are not in the state yet or they're just coming to the state. And they're relatively small populations, and we try to find them and eradicate those populations as quickly as possible. It's very expensive to do that, but it's only more expensive if you don't. So we have about 22 List A species. 7 of those are not in the state yet, but they are in neighboring states. They are unfortunately upwind of us in many cases in Utah, Nevada, and Idaho. So they may be showing up in the state. And what we like to do is have some type of a network where we know as early as possible when something like Medusa head rye comes in from Utah, where it already is, which is it's cheatgrass on steroids. It has about 4 times the silica content of cheatgrass, so nothing will eat it. It is completely impalatable. And it also forms a lot more biomass, so it can have much bigger fires. This is something that we are very concerned about in terms of a species that is not in the state yet. List B strategy, I put here List B strategies. We have 37 List B species, and we've just received or about to receive a large increase in funding from the state legislature, which George mentioned earlier. It's in the long bill, which I think is on the governor's desk. So we're getting very close to having a considerable amount of money that we've not had before to try and to start working on List B species. So what we'll be doing with List B species is starting to work on them in a couple of types of approaches. There's not enough money. We can't go after all of them at once because that would take another 0 after what the legislature just gave us, which is probably not in the cards. But we're looking at area-wide approaches, which may be weed prevention areas, areas where there are relatively few weeds that we want to work on to make sure that they never get there in the first place. They may be areas around national parks or national monuments, but they could also be in areas that have high agricultural productivity, good wildlife value, something like that. We're just developing this right now. And then we'll also focus on specific species. For example, spotted knapweed in the state, it's over many thousands of acres, but it's all over the state, and it's in largely smaller populations until you get down to the southwest. So we can mop up a lot of these outlying populations, kind of like fighting a forest fire. You want to put all the small fires out first before you try and contain the main fire. It's a very similar metaphor. That's kind of how we operate. We also have List C species. These are the ones that you're probably more familiar with, largely because they're fairly common. You can see here there's something like burdock, mullein, bindweed, halogeton, puncture vine, cheatgrass. There's a few others. These are ones that are they're common. They are a problem. These are species that have become so well established and widespread that in terms of the state putting resources in to try and control them, we are essentially going to try and support the counties as much as possible, but we just don't have the resources to do a lot with them. What we will do, though, is try to work with Dan's program in the insectary to work on biocontrol agents for some of them, which we do have for puncture vine and also for bindweed. In fact, I think the bindweed mite is fairly well found throughout many regions of the state. I don't know how many at this point, but so there are ways of controlling some of these species, but not all of them. We also have a watch list in case you don't have enough species to look after, right? And we put together and I've got a few of these, a sheet of watch list species which are either in the state or maybe not yet already. And these are ones that we don't know enough about their distribution or their behavior to know whether they should be listed or allowed to just be left alone, or what their status should be. I've got a bunch over there on the table. Be happy to have them not go home with me. I also have a few of the Noxious Weeds of Colorado guide. These are books that the Colorado Weed Management Association publishes. I brought, I think, 10 or 12 of these with me, and I'm also happy to part with them if you would like to have a souvenir from the last talk or from the weed panel. And these are, they're free for the taking. You've already paid for them if you pay taxes. So we also have a state and private forestry program. This is something that the Forest Service has essentially funded or established an awful lot of the weed programs in the states, in the western states with this funding. It is in the decline in the last couple of years, but it's still around $150,000 a year, which helps with focusing primarily on private lands adjacent to Forest Service lands, and primarily List A species. Right now, they're working on Mediterranean sage and leafy and myrtle spurge. These are ones that come out really early. And then the program, we work collaboratively with pretty much everybody. That's kind of my job, is to coordinate all of this sort of things. So working with counties, towns, municipalities, state and federal land managers, CWMAs, nonprofit organizations. CWMA means cooperative weed management areas. We also work closely with conservation districts and with Colorado State University. We work with George's program, his graduate students, his colleagues, and all the folks up there are very helpful to us in terms of getting the latest research out to the counties. There's also the Palisade Insectary, which Dan is the director of, source of biocontrol agents, which can be a very cost-effective treatment or response to dealing with a number of noxious weeds. Here's Dan in the field, and the little Macinus bug is in the upper part, and this is Dalmatian toadflax, which you mentioned earlier. If you want any more information from the you wait until I invite you to speak somewhere. We have a bunch of resources on the noxious weed site of the Department of Ag's website. We also have, we do have a Noxious Weed Advisory Committee, which is a statewide committee made up of 17 individuals that represent a variety of interests and also geographical areas of the state. I'd encourage any of you who are interested to apply for a position on the committee. There are 5 positions that are coming up this fall. And 2 of them are ag producers. And one's a private landowner, one is at large, and the other one escapes me at the moment. But those applications will be solicited probably towards the end of summer or early fall. This is just, it shows you a little bit about the website. This is the interactive county contact list. You can go there and click on any county and you will get the noxious weed contact for that county. There is some turnover, so we try and keep it up to date as best as possible. And we also have fact sheets on all of the noxious weeds, which will give you an idea of how to identify them, how to treat them, and an awful lot of this information comes from CSU, so we're happy to work with them on it. And that tamarisk is in Utah. It is not in Colorado. So I'm out of time, and I guess we'll move on to, well, we'll do whatever Shelly wants us to do.
So I'm going to make this offer for my rude interruptions. I will donate $20 to the State Noxious Weed Fund. Yeah, I apologize for that. Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Dan Bean, and I've really had the privilege to get to know him over the last, about 5 or 6 years. And he heads up the Colorado Department of Agriculture's biocontrol program. They have an insectary in Palisade over on the western slope. And Dan's been working in the Arkansas Basin since 2008, specifically, well, I guess mostly on tamarisk, but you've also been working on Russian knapweed and a little bit of bindweed. And as Steve mentioned, you know, weed control is really expensive, and these biocontrol agents really provide a cost-effective way to manage a lot of these weeds. So welcome, Dr. Dan Bean.
Thank you, and thanks for sticking around this long and staying awake.
I'm falling down. Oh my God.
So my talk's going to be on the Tamarisk Biocontrol Program primarily, because that's what we've worked on the most in the basin, and I think there's a little end point here that will actually tie water into it too, since this is the water forum. So we can make that connection. I'm going to talk mostly about the northern tamarisk beetle, which is a species that was introduced in the U.S. in 2001 for the control of tamarisk, which also was introduced back in the 1820s. This species of beetle feeds on tamarisk, defoliates tamarisk, and has the potential to really knock it back in terms of biomass, and actually it's capable of killing plants. And tamarisk isn't easy to kill. Let's see. Oops, what am I pushing? Technologically challenged here. I'll talk about four things. The tamarisk program in Colorado, tamarisk program in the basin here, and two new tamarisk biocontrol agents that are one's already here, in addition to the northern tamarisk beetle, and one is coming soon by way of Kansas, which will be really nice. And finally, a little bit about water use in tamarisk and what we might expect for increased water in the basin because of decreased tamarisk. First of all, the tamarisk project got started in Colorado, the implementation phase in 2005 on the western slope, and for various regulatory reasons didn't really start here until 2008. It wasn't our doing, but from 2005 till 2012, we've had major successes on the western slope. And I have a photo that was taken in Dinosaur National Monument. They used to spend a lot of their resources controlling tamarisk on the Green and Yampa rivers. At this point, they do not spend resources controlling tamarisk. By resources, it's the time of the people there and a lot of money and volunteer work and such. They've decided that the tamarisk leaf beetle is capable of doing the job, and now they're just monitoring the decline of tamarisk. So we consider that a major success. A lot of the tamarisk on the western slope looks like this. It's really dying back. There are some native species coming up underneath, or in areas where there aren't native species, we'll end up doing battle with Russian knapweed and Russian olive. We have monitoring sites over on the western slope along a number of rivers there. This one is on the Dolores River. It's near the town of Bedrock. From our monitoring data, we have determined that since the beetles really began defoliating on the western slope in 2006, we've measured mortality at our sites, and at some sites it's as high as 50%, dropping down to 0% at some sites. And this graphic shows our mortality measurements from 2010, 11, 12, and 13. You can see it at the sites where tamarisk is dying back. Every year a little bit more of it dies. The tamarisk leaf beetle comes in, defoliates. The plants make a heroic effort to come back, and oftentimes come fully back. But once you've had a few defoliations, they have trouble. And that's usually when the carbohydrate reserves in the root system start declining, that the plant can't respond. This is the site where we have over 50% mortality. It's called Flume Creek, and it's a small tributary of the Colorado. And you can see what the tamarisk looks like. It's really ratty. You can't find much green on it, but if you got closer and looked at the plants, you can see that some green is coming back on some of the plants, but we have 50% of them are truly dead. This site has 0% mortality, and it's on the Dolores River. But you can see how the plants look. I think you can see that. I think it's good. They're completely devoid of any greenery whatsoever. They have a few little shoots coming back, and the beetles will come back and chew on those. I don't see how these plants are surviving. But the reason I put this particular slide in is that when the plants are dying back this way, we get a lot of the benefits, economic and ecosystem benefits, that you would get from mortality. They don't produce many seeds, evapotranspiration declines to almost zero, and you have open ground underneath for native plants to return. So one of the things we're trying to figure out is why at some sites you get 50% mortality, some zero. And some of that's related to the number of defoliations that the beetles have caused at those sites. But at the gateway site that you saw with 0% mortality, the beetles have defoliated more times there than any of the other sites. So that doesn't explain it all either. So now we're looking at plant genetics. Tamarisk is a very genetically diverse plant. It's actually a hybrid of Chinensis and Ramosissima, and the balance of those two genomes is, it varies from spot to spot. So we're thinking, well, maybe the genetics of the plants at that location, or maybe it's depth to groundwater, or maybe it's soil salinity. In any case, we haven't figured it out yet, and we're working on it. In the Arkansas Basin, it's home to more tamarisk than the rest of the state put together. And I think George mentioned the value of mapping. The Tamarisk Coalition mapped tamarisk in the state of Colorado a few years ago, 2005, I think. And it's been very valuable to us in terms of where are we going to target our efforts. We're going to target where the most tamarisk is. And what they found is that this basin has by far the most of all the river basins in Colorado. And we turned our attention to the Arkansas Basin when we were first able to collect and move beetles within the state. Like, this is the first place we looked and said, got to do something about that. And that was 2008 when we first started the project. What else do I have on this slide? Oh, we did our releases at Fountain Creek, the first releases. Fountain Creek and near Boone. In 2009, we really ramped up, and this is where Shelly became a critical partner of ours. It's really difficult when you're over on the western slope to find partners in the Arkansas River Valley. I think we would have been really flying blindly, but Shelly knew so many different people that wanted to control their tamarisk that she was able to connect us up with a lot of different landowners in the basin, and really strategically target a lot of the different drainages in the basin, which was great. So in 2009, we did major releases. We released over 100,000 beetles throughout the upper basin, and also near Holly, which I'll talk about in a minute. I'll flip back to that. I won't go to the next slide quite yet. I'll just say that in 2010, we did major releases throughout the valley again of the tamarisk leaf beetle, and we're very unhappy in general by the end of 2010. It seemed like the beetles were barely hanging on. They weren't doing much. They were established here and there, but not doing a great job, and I wasn't particularly happy with it. And everybody was looking at me like, oh, these beetles are going to do something? I said, well, maybe not. But then in 2011, we were pleased that we started picking them up in a lot of the places where we'd done releases in 2009. So it takes a while. Biocontrol is always like that. It takes a while for them for the populations to build and for them to start having an impact on the plants. So in 2011, the Tamarisk Coalition did surveys of beetles, and the bigger the red circle, the more beetles they found in this, using a sweep protocol. In June, the beetles were out and found throughout the upper basin. I must also add that CSU is doing some experiments in the basin. Scott Nissen, Andrew Norton, and their graduate students, and they did some releases too. So it wasn't all us; it was CSU involved in this project too. By the end of 2011, beetles were really moving up and down the main stem and a lot of the tributaries, which made us extremely happy. They were in the Boone area where we'd done our releases in 2009 and 2008, and we're perpetually disappointed for the next 2 years. They actually took off, and on Fountain Creek they took off. In 2012, we had major defoliations throughout the upper basin, and that's Shelly staring at a defoliated plant that I didn't know if we would ever get that type of defoliation up in the purgatory up around Honey. And that particular landowner is smiling. He was very happy with the results. On Fountain Creek, We had complete defoliation in 2012. The landowner, Bill Alt, was very excited, and then he came back and he was very disappointed because the tamarack started growing back, which it always does. It takes a long time to kill the plant off, but the trees are really knocked back. There's native vegetation growing up underneath, and the beetles are doing their job. So from 2008, when we started our monitoring on Fountain Creek, to 2012, you can see what happened to tree number 10. Really got completely trashed, and most of the branches are dead. That tree is still alive. It's still trying to send up greenery. But the beetles are in the area. They're providing constant herbivory pressure, and that plant's never going to be the same. After 2012, and the upper basin experiencing multiple defoliations in a lot of the tributaries and main stem, we decided to move downstream and see what was happening in the lower basin. We had done some releases, particularly in Prowers County, and they hadn't been successful. So we started surveying off the main stem. This is near Blue Lake, and we started finding beetles at least 50 miles away from any of our releases. So they had really started moving around the basin by 2013. Now we have to be more strategic about what we do. We have to find out where the beetles are not established and find out why and get them established. This map is pretty indicative of where we stood in 2013. The lower part of the Arkansas River, the lower basin, has virtually no beetles, and that's been one of the nagging things, nagging professional problems that I've faced. How do we get beetles established there? And then you might ask, well, you probably just didn't release enough. But when you see how many we released in various counties, Prowers gets number one. They had about 500,000 beetles released and none established. So that's one of our big question marks, like how are we going to solve that problem of getting beetles into the lower basin? They seem to be doing well in the upper basin. According to our monitoring, they're starting to knock the plants back. We have a very willing landowner, Rick Enstrom, and the Enstrom property. He's allowed us to release probably release 400,000 beetles on his property. We surveyed it in 2012 after major releases. They were doing pretty well. 2013, we went back. We spent half a day sweep surveying, go with insect nets, go up and down the river, see if we have any populations of beetles left, and we found 0. So we were quite disappointed with that. One of the reasons is probably due to the fact that there are a lot of ants in the leaf litter, and the life cycle of the beetle is to feed as in the larval stage on the plant, crawl down into the leaf litter and pupate, and then emerge as adults and move back up on the plant. So when you're in the leaf litter under a tamarisk plant, you're really susceptible to a lot of predation. And predation is primarily ant predation. They're the most voracious things that live in the leaf litter, and we might have a problem, especially on the lower Arkansas, with ants. This is our hot dog survey, as we called it. You put a slice of a hot dog in a plastic cup and stick it in the leaf litter and see how long it takes to become covered with ants. This massive number of ants found the hot dog within 10 minutes. So if you're a pupating tamarisk beetle, you're probably going to get chewed. When I started the project, I wasn't working at the insectary, but I was working on finding the tamarisk leaf beetles in their native lands, not finding them, but cooperating with people that had the good luck to go around and find them, and developing them for release. So we had 4 subspecies from different climatic zones in the old world, and we developed all 4 of them. The ones we use in Colorado are the northern tamarisk beetles, which are the ones on your left, and then the other 3 were also developed, and they ended up being released in West Texas. After the taxonomists got a hold of them, they divided the 4 subspecies into species, elevated them to species level. Now we consider them sibling species. They took off really well in West Texas in 2012, and suddenly West Texas was experiencing massive tamarisk defoliations. This got me really interested because I felt like West Texas, Lower Arkansas, they're pretty close to each other. 2013, they just exploded out of West Texas up through Oklahoma and into Kansas. We have contact with a farmer near Ashland, Kansas, who sends us pictures of the beetles that are defoliating tamarisk near his place, and I'm very excited to see that they're out again this season on the Cimarron, potentially moving into Colorado. They're going to be on the Arkansas in no time and moving into Colorado. These beetles are a different species, very closely related, same preference for tamarisk, probably more well adapted to this environment, this climate, probably a better match for the lower Arkansas. And that's why I'm really optimistic that soon, I have this slide in there to show that the beetles that are moving in are probably a hybrid of two beetles that were introduced in, I said there were 3 species. 2 of them interbreed very well. And from all indications from the taxonomists I know, it's probably a hybrid. And it has this hybrid has some of the good qualities of each of the 2, and that's probably going to make them do very well here. And it's a hybrid of elongata and carinata, which originally came from Uzbekistan and from Greece. So we're thinking that they're going to enter the basin probably around Holly somewhere, and we should have begin seeing defoliations in the lower Arkansas also. The goal is to get the entire Arkansas basin defoliated periodically and regularly, and for the tamarisk to die back to the point where people aren't worried about it anymore. It's just it's an occasional plant here and there, but you don't have those large stands that are using water, degrading wildlife habitat, and all the bad things that it does. A third agent that has already entered the system is Coniatus splendiculus, the splendid tamarisk weevil. It's called that because it's so pretty. It was also tested, host range tested, but it was an accidental introduction, probably somewhere in Arizona. And it probably came in, who knows, in the Phoenix airport area was the first place where we started getting reports of it in 2006, but it's moved throughout the western U.S. and it's entered Colorado in 2011. We found it out here in 2012. Coniatus has an advantage. It doesn't have to go into the leaf litter, but when the larva develops and is ready to pupate, it actually spins this basket around itself. And this is something that you can look out for. If you see these tiny baskets in your tamarisk, the Coniatus is present. I have a feeling that in this basin it'll be more and more common within the next 5 years. It certainly is in the western slope. You see a stick in one of the photos is a stick that's got all these little baskets up and down, have red arrows pointing to them all. That's where a Coniatus larva has finished feeding and has woven a basket, and there are probably 20 of them on that one tamarisk stem, and all the new buds that had come off of it were chewed down. So we feel like this is another biocontrol that will have a negative impact on tamarisk. And when you combine it all together, you can say that I think tamarisk in the basin it's going to be on a decline. Now, it's not going to go away as fast as people want it to. That never happens with biocontrol, but it's on a decline. I would like to very briefly talk about water. If I was an expert in evapotranspiration, I might spend more time on this, but I would rather just talk about a couple of studies that have been done and say what the bottom lines of the studies were. Tamarisk as a phreatophyte gets its roots into the water table and does have a high evapotranspirative rate. It's able to lower water tables, it's able to dry up streams and seeps, and probably has an impact on water in larger rivers, but that's impossible to measure. As anybody who works with stream flows or river flows knows, that small impact would be impossible. But it is nonetheless an impact. The first study was carried out in Lovelock, Nevada, where the beetles were first started doing major damage to tamarisk. This was also the first field site where I worked with the beetles. And I was working next to the person, Robert Pattison, that did this study. He used devices that you attach to the tamarisk plant that measure sap flow, in other words, measure flow up from the roots for evapotranspiration. And he measured sap flow in individual trees before and after they were defoliated, and really not too surprisingly found in the lower right is evapotranspiration off of a branch before and after defoliation. You can see it's high before, after defoliation, almost none. That sort of speaks to the fact that it's the green plant tissue that transpires. Measuring also, he also used some of the convection towers that are commonly used to measure ET, and he did laborious measurements of tamarisk plants throughout his field site and determined the total volume of wood and the total ET on a site, measured over 2 seasons, followed defoliation and refoliation, saw that as soon as the plants put out new green tissue, they start transpiring again, which is no surprise to anyone, but he quantified the whole thing. And essentially came up with, for his steady site, which is about 1,800 hectares, he found a 2,500 acre feet per season decline in evapotranspiration, which is substantial. And when you consider the size of the tamarisk infestation, it's quite substantial. The thing about looking at ET and water savings, you're not getting that water back in the stream necessarily. He measured water table increases after the tamarisk was defoliated. So it might just be a water table savings, but it's water nonetheless that isn't being evaporated by a noxious weed. The second study I want to mention took place on the Virgin River, which flows out of Utah and down into Arizona and Nevada. It eventually ends up in Lake Mead. It's a classic desert river, and it flows through Great Basin Desert and starts to enter the Mojave. The person that did the study really wasn't, for this particular study, she wasn't so interested in water saving. She was interested in following the progress of the beetles through the system. And she wanted to measure beetle movement by way of defoliated tamarisk plants. Now, she'd done a lot of work on ET and beetle defoliation previous to this, but she got the idea that, while it's so visible, we should be able to follow the beetle movement from satellite imagery just by looking at defoliation. And another note, because I'm going to tell you that 10% of the Virgin River flow has been saved by having the beetles there. She doesn't really like biocontrol. She's a colleague of mine. I'm on this study, but she doesn't like biocontrol in general, so she's definitely not going to overestimate the value of it. You can see what the Virgin River looks like. I don't know if you can, it's hard to tell. The Virgin River, as it comes out of the mountains and spreads out, has about half a mile channel that's completely choked out with tamarisk. When the beetles moved in, completely defoliated every last plant. She could look at satellite imagery, this is MODIS imagery, and look at what she calls NDVI, which stands for Normalized Density Vegetation something, index, and basically see the tamarisk being defoliated on satellite images and look at and calculate evapotranspiration from this imagery plus on the ground. She's got some ground truthing also. She doesn't rely strictly on this. She's done it in a lot of different settings, and I feel very comfortable that she's able to do it well and accurately. This is what I think you can see. This is a photo of the Virgin River, kind of right in the middle of her study area. I've been down there a few times looking at beetle movement and defoliation. You can see that there are a few cottonwoods, a few native plants that are green, standing out above a completely defoliated tamarisk background. So there's still a little bit of ET going on here, but it's mostly from the native plants. She's also calculated the total amount of ET before defoliation and after defoliation, and subtracting those two numbers, she comes up with a figure that is equal roughly to 10% of the average annual flow in the Virgin River. So tamarisk was a major player in evapotranspiration along this reach of river, and when the beetles have moved in and defoliated, suddenly evapotranspiration just went way down, and there is a water savings that is substantial in terms of percentage of the flow of this desert river being about 10%. Not to extrapolate at all, and I don't want to, it's evapotranspiration on the Virgin River is very different from here. There are so many different factors that are different, between the two places. But if you would extrapolate the Pattison number, which might be more in line with the Arkansas Basin, to the Arkansas Basin and how much tamarisk we have, and if the beetles can successfully keep it defoliated and knocked back, you might get a savings of close to 40,000 acre feet. But those numbers can only be verified by somebody coming here and doing an ET study on plants after they're being in the process of being defoliated. I think that's it for me, and I guess we'll have the panel discussion.
Thanks, Dave.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Questions?
Yes, I have a question for Dr. Bean. On these beetles, I'm aware of the studies that you've had, and also on the Dolores in Lower Colorado. Are you ever concerned that maybe in this cross, the beetles coming up with a newer hybrid of them ever wanting to, let's say, eat another tree such as a cottonwood or a fruit tree or anything like that?
No, they're even the hybrids won't leave the realm of tamarisk. It's something that we should look at as a formality. We definitely check that out. But they're completely tuned into tamarisk and have been throughout Eurasia. That's the only thing they feed on. There's probably been some hybridization in Eurasia. Nobody's ever found them on anything else. So I'm confident in their host range, and I don't think that we'll ever have to worry about host range jump. I mean, I'm not going to say 100% for sure, because nothing in biology works that way, but I don't think we have to worry about that.
How'd you get your collection of beetles to start with, to put in the area?
For the Arkansas Basin?
Yeah.
We collected those off of the western slope. Well, most of our collections were actually from the Dolores, because that was the first place where we had enough beetles to collect.
Do you have a net or something to catch them so you can put them someplace else?
We do. We have insect nets, and we come up to a tamarisk that has beetles on it, stick the net under, because they like to drop. Grab the branch and shake it. And they drop into the net, and you do that for a while, being anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour into the net, keep knocking them down, and then at the bottom of the net you have this giant mass of beetles trying to get up. Dump them into a plastic container and stick them in a cooler. We also we quantify them by volumetrically. We have some containers that are marked 1,000 beetles, 2,000 beetles, and we dump them in, and we get up to 1,000 beetle point. And we've counted out aliquots of 1,000 beetles, so we know what 1,000 beetle volume is. We don't count them individually anymore.
If 2012 had been a wet year instead of a dry year, would they have made the progress that they made?
That's a good question. If one thing that will stop them is a late spring, that'll really, you need 2 generations per season to really do well, and if you have a late spring and they're delayed, coming out and getting started, you really only have about a generation and a half. Wet, they don't like necessarily, especially the northern Tamis beetle is not that fond of humid conditions. So I think that's another thing that stops them in the Arkansas Basin.
And 2012 had a remarkably warm, dry start right from the 1st of March, so.
That could have been a major factor, because it was a great year.
Or something made good use of 2012.
In regards to cameras, if the beetles take care of the cameras, and then native vegetation returns, is there much water savings in terms of if cameras is replaced by cottonwood? And then a second question, kochia. It seems like we're constantly battling kochia. You eradicate it, it comes back, you eradicate it, it comes back, you eradicate it, it comes back. What's the strategy to get natives back? So cameras question first and then the kochia question.
I'll answer the cameras question and somebody else answer the kochia question. If we replace Tamis 1-to-1 with cottonwood, there'll be no water savings, essentially. That won't happen. There's no way that you're going to get the forest of cottonwood that we have at Tamis. What eventually comes in after Tamis is taken out, our plants, most plants don't keep up with Tamis at all in terms of ET, and if more upland plants come in and replace it, then you'll continue to have that water savings. And I see there's no way in a place like the Virgin River and some of the places that are further along down the line, Tamis is dying back. You see decreased ET lasting, and I don't think that we're going to see. We'll never see the native high water use phreatophytes come back and fill in where the Tamis is.
And also on more xeric sites, like I don't know if you're familiar with Tempest Creek, but a lot of our arroyos around here are really xeric, and there's really no cottonwoods or willows, but there's a lot of tamarisk. So I think you'll see a lot more water savings in those areas as compared to like the main stem of the Arkansas.
As far as
Push that.
As far as managing kochia, sorry. As far as managing kochia, like all weeds, but it's very, very important with the annual weeds, is plant competition. It's very difficult down here because of the continued drought that happens. So you're really stuck managing it with herbicides. Most likely, I don't think we're really ever going to have biocontrol of kochia. And what I've noticed around the state is you get the combination of Russian thistle and kochia. You control one, you get the other to replace it. And we'll have a half a dozen germination events over the course of the year. So we've had our best success in our research by using a herbicide that has a residual in the soil. And you get most of those, but it's not foolproof. Like, so we've been focusing quite a bit of energy on a herbicide called sulfentrazone. But there's many others. And the trade name for that one, unfortunately, it's just a non-crop herbicide. Now it's called Portfolio. But there's other herbicides. Vista, people still use dicamba 2,4-D, works quite well. But we're running into some resistance issues too, so it's actually going to get more complex with time. We have, in the wheat fallow rotations, we commonly use Roundup, and we have lots of Roundup-resistant kochia. It's one of the herbicide resistance is one of the key management problems we have to deal with for the immediate future and the distant future. So we have some solutions, but it tends to be a tail chaser every year. All you have to have is one or two neighbors that decide they don't have enough funding to do anything, and you have a problem scattered everywhere because it has a short soil seed reserve. Fire always scares people, scares me too, but I've known people use fire to exhaust the soil seed reserve. It doesn't kill the seed, but it will cause it to germinate. So on a small scale, you could do something like that too, but on a large scale, that obviously is prohibitive.
Let's give the panel another round of applause. Thank you, Shelly.